I'm gonna get us started. Welcome everybody to the best gospel in the New Testament. I am swearing that to be true. The Gospel of John. We're kicking off today. Okay. We're gonna do this over 8 weeks. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. And before we get started, I want to open it up to some input from you all. Okay. Question for you all. What are your assumptions, or what do you remember hearing about the Gospel of John? Diane has a very unhappy look on her face.
Well, the Catholic Church, not too much from the Gospel of John, not too much preached from the Gospel of John. And what I knew about it is at any sports event is the 3:16. God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten son. That's always at sporting. Somebody holds up that sign.
Yep. What else have people either heard or assume about the Gospel of John? Go ahead. Just yell it out.
Well, it was always in the gospel part of the Mass in the Catholic Church. I mean, he would come every once in a while, but, Catholics don't study the Bible.
Yeah, I know.
I remember the beginning.
Okay.
I love the beginning.
Yep. What else? What else strikes you as something you think about, John?
For me, it's a great big goose egg. I just nothing comes to mind.
Me too.
And that reflects my religious background. I'm not a Catholic. I wasn't a regular churchgoer up until 30 years ago. So half my life, I wasn't a regular churchgoer. So it's like, I'm sure when I hear things, it'll be like, oh, okay, but if you say this is from Luke, I'm like, I have some awareness of Luke, but
What else? Anybody have any preconceptions or assumptions about John?
I'm with Tony. We went to the same church, same school. I know nothing.
Okay.
I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. They preach from the Gospel of John all the time.
Oh, yeah.
oh,
Interesting.
I think John is such a believer. He just keeps telling you, you should believe this. And sometimes he gets so tied up in the words. He keeps saying the same words over and over again. It's like a person who's overexcited, but he definitely is a believer. He just wants you to believe like he does.
Okay. Thanks, Marie.
cool.
Anyone else?
I've always heard that the guy that wrote John also wrote Revelation. I don't know whether that's true or not.
We'll touch on that today, Bernie. Okay, let me, anybody else before I move on? I'm going to name my bias here. I love the Gospel of Mark. For me, it's like the cleanest pathway in terms of the way. I love the humanity of Jesus in Mark. I love so much about Mark. It's just a get down to business gospel. And John is at the whole other end of that. And so I have avoided John with a passion. It's no mistake that we have covered almost everything in the New Testament except for this gospel, because I was that hesitant to take it on. So those are my biases. Okay, let's go on to what do we hope to get? What do you want to get out of this?
History and context.
Okay.
Yeah, what I can learn from John, or clarification, or just more info about him, insight, I guess.
Okay.
How about who is Jesus?
Who is John?
I'm with history and context.
Okay. I'm gonna say we're gonna hit all of that stuff. Okay. So all of this is gonna be covered, and Steve gets the bonus points for today because that's the whole point right there, is who is Jesus. And I'm going to go back to, you've heard me say this 1,000 times, and Lindsay kind of nailed it. Context matters. And in John, context is really, really important. And I'll talk about why in a bit. Context is going to shape meaning. It's going to shape content, and content's going to shape meaning. So that's not supposed to be Book of Revelation, it's Book of John. But the thing about what we do, what we're going to be doing here is trying to understand who was this written for, why was it written, and then what can we mine from it today? Okay, and there's a lot of beauty in this. We're doing it over 8 weeks. Today, we're going to do the history, the context, who's John, kind of the key themes in the gospel. And we're going to just touch on the prologue. And from this point on, then, we're basically, I'll talk about the signs, but we're going to be taking it about 2 to 3 chapters a week. And we'll go all the way up to the last Tuesday in March. And then we'll have, I think, 2 weeks off in March. And then in April, I'm doing a 4-day in a row series for Holy Week on the Passion Week. So 8 weeks. So this is week 1. And I want to remind you about something. Just kind of refresh your mind on the pre and post Easter. The pre-Easter Jesus Christ, mystic, healer, teacher, social prophet. He started a movement. Jewish, stood really firmly in that basis of the Jewish Bible. The post-Easter Jesus is what we understand about Jesus after he died. So the post-Easter Jesus starts after he dies. That's who we're going to meet in the New Testament. And the post-Easter Jesus we're going to meet in John is different than any other gospel. Okay? The other thing I want you to kind of understand is a concept called Christology. And that Christology is basically the study of Jesus Christ and understanding who Jesus was as a human or divine or mixture of both. So think of Christology on kind of a spectrum of 1 to 5. Low Christology is Jesus is more human than divine. So in Mark, you see a lot of low Christology. Jesus gets angry. Jesus gets frustrated. A lot of emotions, a lot of things that you won't see later on. Look, much more human expressions that as you progress through the Gospels, you see disappearing. This is regarded as the oldest Christianity. So this is what the earliest Christians believed. That basically Jesus was a human who was exalted or adopted as God's son when he was resurrected. Okay, so that's a low Christology. A high Christology goes to the whole other end of the spectrum, and that's what really emphasizes the divine aspects of Jesus's identity. So this understanding that Jesus is God who became human, very different than the other end of the spectrum of Christology. And the high Christology, this came after the time of Paul. So this is more end of the 1st century, around the time that John is written. We're going to encounter, for the vast majority of the Gospel of John, we're going to be dealing with high Christology. So a real divine understanding of Jesus. Okay. Okay. I have so many funny memes in this one. So. Mark, let's get down to business. Then we had Luke. Before I begin, let me tell you the backstory that led up to all this. Matthew, before I begin, let me give you the genealogy so you know this is about a real person. John, before I begin, let me explain why it's important to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. This is one of my favorite paintings of John, depictions of the evangelist John, the author. So some early thinkers on John's Gospels. Basically, some of the earliest thinkers on the Gospel of John really kind of elevated this gospel as a spiritual gospel. So Clement, spiritual gospel; Origen, first fruits of the gospel; Augustine, gospel of the Spirit; and then even up into the Reformation and the Reformation thinkers, Calvin, big fan of John. The soul of Jesus is revealed in John. Martin Luther, far to be preferred over the other three because it will show you Christ and teach you everything you need to know. I would have called BS on that comment a year ago. I think there's something there, and I think you will see at the end when we get to this too. Okay. Unequivocally, John is one of the great masterpieces of ancient literature. It is the favorite gospel of mystics and philosophers. It does appeal to both the heart and the mind, and scholars maintain you can study this thing for decades and decades, and you will not come to the bottom of the well on this gospel. It is just that big in terms of subversive meaning, all of the different ways that this can hold understandings of Jesus and of God. Okay, what's unique about John? Almost all of it. Almost all of it. 90% of what you are about to read is not in any other gospel. So it is a complete tabula rasa for the most part. So I want you to kind of, it's almost like you have to do a palate cleanse, but you have to do like a mind cleanse to go into John, because it really is just that unique. The content, 90% is going to be new. There are stories in this that are not told anywhere else in the Bible, and some of them go on for a long time. Some of the stories that John tells, the other gospels are going to tell, but he's going to tell them differently. And you will not see a whole lot of stuff that you think of as stories about Jesus. First off, there are no parables, 0 parables. You know, you think about how much our understanding of Jesus is through the parables that he taught. None of them will be in John. Jesus does not cast out demons, doesn't eat without costs, doesn't talk about the end times or the kingdom of God. 0. John does not have Jesus calling on people to deny themselves or love their neighbor or renounce their possessions or help the poor. You're not going to see any of that in John. So the first question should probably be, well, then what the heck is in there, right? Fair question. But I think this is really important to think about. You almost have to like strip away all your expectations about what you're going to find there, because if you're basing it on the other 3 gospels, you're going to go down the wrong rabbit trail. Okay, in John's gospel, Jesus's ministry lasts 3 years. In all the other ones, it's just a year. In John's gospel, Jesus's ministry is concentrated in Jerusalem. Very different from the other 3, where it has it centered in Galilee. And Capernaum, right? He's based in Capernaum, all of those. In John, Jesus is going to teach in a very, very different way. What he teaches, how he teaches, and where he teaches is all going to be different. In John, Jesus is going to deliver these long philosophical discourses, right? It's going to go on and on for chapters. None of that little pithy Mark. That's not John, right? And in John's gospel, Jesus is almost always just going to talk about himself. And just what Steve said about his question, who he is, who's his identity? and what it means for people to believe in him, love him, obey him, and abide in him. And there is an abundant use of symbolism in John, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, these are the stories that are unique to John. You're not going to find them anywhere else. Andrew, Philip, and Nathaniel being called, the changing of water into wine, Nicodemus, he's the guy that's going to come in the middle of the night, the Samaritan woman at the well, the crippled man at the pool of Bethesda, the adulterous woman facing stoning, which is a very, very interesting one about how that gets in there. The Lazarus story, foot washing, and Thomas, doubting Thomas. These do not exist anywhere else. And this is the stuff that we think of as New Testament that we will not see in John. Nothing about the birth, no mention of his baptism, nothing about going into the wilderness and being tested. He doesn't eat with tax collectors and sinners, no transfiguration, no parables, no exorcisms. He does not condemn the rich. He does not call for helping the poor. He does not talk about loving your neighbors, not judging or forgiving your enemies. Doesn't call for people to repent or deny their possessions like you hear in Luke. No predictions of Jerusalem's downfall, which is all of the other ones. No mention of Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper, and almost no mention of the kingdom of God. So again, this is a whole different book. It's almost like, think of the first three, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, as not a different book, not even a different room in the library, a different library in a different city, in a different state. That's what we're dealing with here, okay? Okay. John's going to lay way more stress on the divinity of Jesus than any of the Gospels. We are going to encounter high Christology, so much so that it's almost going to seem like Jesus is alien to this world. And John's going to claim that God becomes flesh, and then that flesh meaning fully human, but starts as God and then becomes flesh. And that Jesus does this so that God can enter human history and save human beings. And I want you to really put an asterisk about what it means to be saved, because John is heavily dependent upon for understandings of atonement theology. And I want you to just kind of hold off what it means to be saved, because we're going to be working through that in here, okay? But in John, Jesus comes to save human beings, to save creation, okay? And at its core, this is a story about God told through Jesus's experiences, but it's a story about God. It's one of my favorite memes. I think it very much encapsulates where we're about to go. I like this one too. I want you to really get it in your brain how different it is we're going, okay? Okay. How did John end up in the biblical canon? We had, for those of you that didn't do my Bible class recently, we covered this, but the four Gospels that were pretty much understood as scriptural by the end of the 1st century, start of the 2nd century. And by that point in time, they were understood to be read together, right? The first three had almost immediate acceptance. John came a little slower than that. It took a while for John to get, adapted, accepted by the hierarchy of the church. The other three much more came on board. But by the end of the 2nd century, we're really much done, right? By the end of the 2nd century, we have the canon of the 4 Gospels, we have Paul's letters, and the other ones are starting to come up. By the end of the 2nd century, we're going to see John really kind of inch ahead as the preferred gospel for the kind of theological leaders of the time. And John is going to be the basis from which they are going to jump to develop dogma and doctrine. So it's all going to come from John. Not all, but a lot of it. Okay, who wrote it? Tradition says that it was written by John, son of Zebedee, one of Jesus's gospels, Jesus's disciples. And, we know that's not true because we know it's written by the end of that 1st century. It's probably the latest to be written. But what some of the work coming out now about John thinks there's parts of John that may be some of the earliest stuff that we have. Because John is one of those gospels that has had a lot of editors in it. A lot of folks rewriting, revising, and we're going to encounter some of those revisions as we work through this. But that John was probably written in stages. And but the version that we have really was pretty much locked down by the end of the 1st century, mid 2nd century. So there is really no indication that John knew about the other 3. So it's almost like John was written in a vacuum. There's nothing that biblical scholars can tie and kind of cross-reference to say that John had the other 3 gospels in front of him. We know that John is, when John was finished, not when John was started, because we all know when John was started. When John was finished, we know it was one of the latest ones. And it's because we can tie it to the history of the time, first and foremost. And this is one of the things we're going to talk about a lot in here. Because in John, we're going to encounter the very, very tragic and horrific consequences of the divorce between Judaism and Christianity. And in John, you've got a highly developed theology. You're getting into high Christology. So the farther away from Jesus's death we go, the farther we go on that continuum of understanding Jesus as God. Okay, we think that John was probably written for a group of very highly religious and motivated Jews who at some point in time incorporated a group of Samaritans. And we're going to talk about this when we come to the woman at the well and why that story may be there. This gospel was most likely written for a community that was really, really struggling and almost had like a siege mentality. They were under attack. They were outcasts. They were outsiders. They were the Jews that believed that Jesus was divine and God, operating in a Jewish system where they were the minority and were starting to be thrown out of the synagogues. So John's gospel, the people that this gospel is written for, they really think of them as almost like a siege mentality. And because of that, because they were such outsiders, because they existed as such a small cult within this larger understanding of Judaism, there's this incredible need for unity. There's this incredible need to differentiate themselves, to say, here are the faith practices that hold us together, that make us unique, right? And this is very different from Luke. Luke wrote, and he says right in there, I wrote this to basically tell you the story to convince you to be a Christian. That is not why John's writing this. He's not writing to convert anybody. He is writing to people who already believe. They already believe, and they are either actively in this siege community, or they're closet Christians who want to believe, but they haven't broken with the synagogue yet. So John's not trying to convince anybody to convert. He's talking to the believers who have already crossed over, and that's who he's writing for. Okay. And really what John's doing is trying to, very similar to those of you that did Revelations with me, inspire this community that is really under all of these pressures to maintain their beliefs during this troubled time. So that's why he's writing, and that's who he's writing to. Okay, some ideas on how John came to be. We're going to encounter somebody in John's gospel called the beloved disciple. And this isn't any other gospel, nothing like it. And earlier thinkers thought that the beloved disciple was an actual eyewitness to the events of Jesus's life, but not one of the 12. And that was where the John tradition sprung from. But he probably didn't write the gospel, but he was like a source, and that fed that tradition. And we'll meet the beloved disciple, and we're going to do a lot of work around that. Also, there's thinking that John was written by a theologian within the Johannine community, or a group of them. Again, biblical scholars can really see multiple cooks in the kitchen on John. This is not one author for the most part. They think absolutely John is at the least a second generation Christian. John is a really, really gifted writer and a really highly gifted theologian. And we're going to encounter that in the reading. So, and then after the beloved disciple passed away, it got redacted, it got revised, it got edited, and it got molded, this kind of source document by all these different hands to kind of align with these emerging understandings of who Christ was. And part of how this shows up is like there's additions that they think are very late. Like Peter gets rehabilitated in this story. And, that's not how it happens in Mark, right? But in John, Peter's story actually comes out pretty good, which very much aligns with how the hierarchy of the church was emerging to understand Peter, and how Rome was becoming the center of Christianity. Okay, let's talk about Jesus's Jewishness, because this is going to come into play, and every week we're going to encounter this. Jesus and his followers are Jewish in John's gospel, clearly. The Jesus in John's gospel is drawing on Jewish scripture. So Jesus is standing on the Hebrew Bible, and that is from which he is drawing his source and where he is speaking. Here's something different in John, though. Jesus is never going to quote from that Bible. He's going to allude to it. He's going to draw events and characters. But in John, you're never going to see those quotes like quoting Isaiah, like the one we did in church on Sunday, where Betsy was reading the piece about Jesus being thrown off the cliff. There's a piece in there where actually that is quoting the book of Isaiah. And that happens a lot in Matthew in particular, some in Luke too. You're never going to see that in John. He's going to reference those books, but he's not going to cite them. And then there's some pieces of John that kind of dance on the separatists, the sectarians that you found that went and lived as the divorced society, and those were the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we're going to see some of that too. And this, but what we're going to encounter here is that understanding Jesus as the revelation of God is going to cause so much conflict within the Jewish tradition that these people are existing within. And it's going to cause a lot of heartbreak. Okay, so what do we know about John and the Jews? Best guess is that John has experienced the Jewish community as an enemy of his understanding of Christ. This is the most hostile picture that we will see in the whole New Testament of the relationships between Jesus and the Jews. So the term, the Jews, 6 times we see it in Mark, 5 in Matthew, 7 in Luke, 70 times in John. So much of what we're going to encounter is about this conflict with within that Jewish community. John is going to portray the world as an incredibly hostile environment that hates Jesus and hates Jesus's followers, and that the Jews are the opponents of Jesus and his followers, even though Jesus was a Jew and his followers were Jew, right? Because what we're going to see in John is throughout this, Jesus is going to rebuke the Jews for their failure to understand him or recognize him. And John's going to say, you got to make a choice. Are you a disciple of Jesus, or are you a disciple of Moses, the Jews? And if you said, I'm a follower of Jesus, then that had big consequences. And at this time, it meant expulsion from the synagogue, which meant expulsion from your community. So we're going to encounter some really harsh languages in here. A lot of when you see very horrific anti-Semitic hate-driven messages towards the Jewish people that are citing the Bible, they are pulling from John, right? So it's completely divorced from the context, which is this is an interreligious dissension. So you have a group of Jews who believe Jesus is God. And then you have a huge community, a significantly larger community of Jews who do not. And it is that tension between the two of them. And John, operating within that tension, he's going to write about. And then 2,000 years later, or 1,500 years later, like Luther is going to do, we're going to remove it from that context. And we're just going to be left with the hateful language. So I'm going to come back to this again and again because we'll have to be really mindful of this. And I want you going in really aware whenever you encounter this language. I want you to be thinking about that small sect of Jews being kicked out of the synagogue and what that meant to lose your community, your place of worship, your neighbors. And John is going to come out swinging, right? And it was pretty harsh at this time. John was written like the end of the 1st century, and that was when these Jewish Christians were being kicked out. In John, the Jews are going to attempt to stone Jesus and people who confess Jesus as the Messiah. And he's going to talk about them being afraid of the Jews. Okay, so again, we all now have to really hold into our head, John is writing not about Jesus, but about the circumstances of his community 90 years after Jesus died, okay? We're going to have to really hold that in our head. Okay. I think I'm going to beat this to a dead horse, I think. John is the gospel that's going to give us the language that is going to really, really divorce Christianity from Judaism. And because in John, the split is very apparent, who's in, who's out, and who's hostile to those that believe Jesus is God. Okay. Okay, so again, we're going to remember when we read this, John, when we hear this kind of hateful language, when we read that, it is not Jesus experiencing that or Jesus speaking about that. It is a community 90 years later in pain, in a siege mentality. Okay, I feel like I beat that horse to death. Okay. Apparently I didn't. You know, and I'll tell you why, and I might even bring some of this up. 1500 years later, Martin Luther is going to use the Gospel of John as justification for some of the most atrocious things done to the Jewish people. And he's going to lay out a 6-part plan that will include burning sacred documents, kicking them out of their homes, burning their synagogues. And that 6-part plan will then be enacted 400 years later by the Nazis with the addition of the death camps. And so the source document is really Luther pulling on John. So that's what's at stake here in terms of how atrociously we have misunderstood this gospel. There is hate in there, absolutely. We can't ignore it. And if we deny it, I think we kind of run from bigger issues. If we divorce that hate from its historical context, we end up with the things Luther's going to write in 1500 years, and we end up straight at the gates of Auschwitz. That's where it takes us. This is going to be a real painful community to try to understand because they are standing at this intersection of such a painful separation from Judaism. Okay. And that is why we're going to encounter some of that language. Okay. It starts with a prologue and it closes with an epilogue. And in between there are 2 books. One is the book of signs and one is the book of glory. And we're going to go through all of that stuff, but that's generally how it's structured. The book of signs has these, he doesn't use the word miracles. John's going to use the word signs because think of them as a sign that's pointing to something. And it's pointing to telling us something about Jesus and then something about God. And these are the signs that we're going to encounter. The other way you can think of John is a series of feasts. It's a big book about a different feast. So it starts with a feast, which is the wedding, and it's going to end with a feast, which is that picnic by the sea with those couples of disciples when he catches all the fish. And there's feasts in the middle. And that feast is going to feed into a theme that we're going to encounter a lot of John, which is about abundance. Okay, key themes. Jesus is the true revelation of God. Number one. And that Jesus is not only the content, but the conveyor of revelation. So that's really one of the big thing about John is Jesus reveals God and tells us what God is like and shows us what God is like. That's the biggest one. As a result of this, and again, this is the only one of the Gospels that's going to identify Jesus as God, is as a result of this, what's going to come out of this is the doctrine of the Trinity, where God is understood as the 3 in 1, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That is going to come out of here. The other thing that's going to come out of here is the theory of incarnation. So the other thing we're going to deal with when we get to Jesus's death is glorification. And John's going to refer to Jesus's death as the hour he is glorified. And this language is the language that has really kind of fed that understanding of salvation through atonement theology, that Jesus died for our sins. And I'm going to ask you to kind of pause on holding that assumption. And again, go back to the fact that we're going to spend some time thinking about what does it mean to be saved and glorified, right? Okay, the other thing we're going to talk about is salvation as abundant life. And this theme of abundance is going to be huge, huge in John's gospel. In John, right, is that it, this was a big misconception I had. I thought John was really about heaven and the future life. It's not. John is really, really about the here and now. And God showing up in humanity at a point in history so that people may have life. And creating this relationship with God. The other big theme is loving one another. And John's going to have way more to say about love than any of the three Gospels combined. This word love occurs over 50 times. And this is where you're going to get things like everyone will know his followers by the love they have for one another. Love one another as I have loved you. Except no mention of loving your neighbor, okay? The focus is going to be on loving each other, the believers loving each other, and this is going to be their new commandment. Okay, why is it worth the read? John really believes that Jesus reveals God's love, right? And in doing this, Jesus reveals God's love for the whole world. That is just an enormous, enormous gift, an enormous, beautiful vision. In this, forgiveness is going to be kind of the norm, expectation in the community. And it is going to give us examples of beautiful pushing outwards and removing boundaries. And we're going to see this in particular in the Samaritan woman story. There's two other ones in there. And again, this was a misconception of my part. I really thought John, I understood it as, 3:16, I am the way. There is just one path. And there's a spaciousness of invitation in John that I'm excited for you to see. And there is a message of abundant life that flows through all of this that is really, really quite powerful. Okay, we're going to dive in. The prologue is in chapter 1. It's the first 18 verses. And I'm only going to pull out a couple of one because the beginning and the end. In the middle, it talks about John the Baptist, and I pulled that piece out because this is really kind of the heart of the Christology. So, okay, Steve, I feel like you need to read the prologue for us.
Okay.
Go ahead.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known.
That is like the crux of John right there. Okay, this is some of the ways that prologue has been painted through the years. I like that one a lot.
Well,
I like that one a lot too. You can think of it at the start as like a hymn or a poem. This is the only place we're going to hear John refer to Jesus as the Word or Logos. At one point in time in our Christian history, this piece, the prologue, was recited at the end of the Eucharistic meal. That's how we close this. Almost all biblical scholars believe this prologue right here is the key to the whole gospel. This is it. And it introduces everything we're going to see throughout the gospel. This opposition of light and darkness. We're going to see a lot of confrontations. The promise of new birth and this hope of new life. This understanding of God working within this almost cosmic framework. Like this is so much more cosmic than anything we have encountered in terms of understanding about God, understanding about Jesus. And this is the model. This is where we're going to come up with this understanding of incarnation. And that is going to shape Christian theology for centuries. At this point in time, this Christian community is really trying to understand who Jesus was and who Christ is moving forward. And John's going to play a pivotal role in this. Okay. This is just kind of we're starting to see the multiple edits already here. So that first part that Steve read seems kind of solemn. This last part seems almost kind of argumentative. And it's because we're seeing different authors, different editors, different time frames. Even right here in this very, very first section, that best guess is this is multiple hands in this. So we're going to encounter that a lot. Okay. What John, the prologue, makes clear is that Jesus was with God since the beginning. That is the foundation, and that's going to tell us who God is and what God says. And that's going to come down to creating life. And it is abundant life. That's what God is about. And that's then what Jesus is about. So Jesus is going to reveal that. Okay. I was going to send us into small groups for this one, but I haven't had a chance to even stop and ask for any questions. So I'm going to stop. But this is what I want to come back to is, what do you see as the key affirmation about Christ in that prologue? And I'll kind of keep it up there and I'll stop sharing. So let me first say general questions, comments, anything that we didn't cover. I know it was a lot. It was a lot. Context matters. Context matters. Think of that. We're just laying the base. Okay. Anybody got a question? Anybody good? Go ahead, Paul. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, in the beginning there, in the first couple lines, there's a pronoun he, and I'm not at all sure who that is or what it refers to. Is that the word?
Yes, they're talking about Jesus.
And so the word is Jesus.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the
And
Word
he.
was God, right? So you could
And
just remove Word and say Jesus. In the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God. That was the beginning, right? So that's what that's saying.
okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Diane.
I'm interested to know what the abundant life would look like. What is the abundant life?
We're going to come to that. We're going to encounter it a lot.
His explanation.
Yeah. And he's going to tell that through stories. And we're going to actually encounter it next week with the wine at the wedding.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We will get there. Go ahead, Tony.
Stories that you said were gonna be in John, I have to take back my initial comment about John, because we did learn about the marriage at Cana. We did learn about a lot of the stories that are coming through. So I was surprised.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually think the Christian tradition kind of draws on John, or the Catholic tradition draws on John. And I think you might see it as we dive into it. Because, that's where we're going to encounter the concept of the Trinity, the concept of incarnation. It's all going to come from John.
Yeah.
Okay, then the question for you all is, what do you think John's really trying to say about Christ in that prologue? What's the big point he wants to get across, or any?
Jesus is God and God is Jesus. They're one and the same.
Yeah.
And apparently God has always been Jesus and Jesus has
Right.
always been God.
Right.
So taking it in the same direction is that Jesus reveals God. He is the essence of God, the substance of God, co-eternal with God, and hence you can believe Jesus as God.
Yep. Jesus is God. Jesus has been with God since the beginning. Jesus reveals God.
That's why it's a Christmas story.
Yeah. Not only does Jesus reveal God, but Jesus himself is the revelation of God.
Yes. It's better said.
If you want, or how one of my seminary instructors said, if you want to understand God, learn about Jesus. That's what John would say. Which I think there's some beauty in that. There's some beauty in that, because some of the stuff we're going to encounter about Jesus and God and John is pretty beautiful. Okay, let me turn it back to you all. Any final thoughts, questions, reactions, concerns?
I'm looking forward to it. It's a little mind blowing because it's so different than, the other. And I understand getting rid of the other gospels, but it's like a new concept. It's big.
It is big.
It's big.
And we're just going to dip our toe in here. Again, like one of the first things I said when we went through this is there's a lot of biblical scholars that have spent decades and decades mining John and never hit the bottom of the well. And so this is just one of those gospels that just you could spend an enormous amount of time on. You're not gonna find the end point.
Well,
No.
to me, the interesting part is having to keep reminding yourself that it's a faction of Jews talking to Jews.
Right.
Yeah.
But fighting with Jews, being hurt and angry, being financially punished, losing their livelihood, their connections, their neighbors, their places of worship, being cast out and being pretty pissed about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to just show you the slide that talks about what we're going to do next. Okay, so next week, I'm going to have you read through 1 through the end of 3. And go back and I would say read that prologue again, read it aloud, spend time with it. You're going to encounter some kind of key components. Jesus is going to call the disciples, and it's different. It's different than how you've seen it in other places. You're going to encounter the wedding, a story that is not in any of the other gospels. And you're going to encounter John the Baptist in a very different way than you have in the other Gospels. So all of the things that you're going to encounter for the next kind of section going 1 through 3 may sound familiar, but almost just try to like cleanse your mind as you go into it and read it afresh and take off any preconceived notions, understandings of what you're going into. Because immediately when you think of Jesus calling the disciples, there's things that probably come to mind for you. Let them go. Just let them go. When you think about Jesus at a party or a feast, let it go. Let it go. And just discover who Jesus is in this gospel. That's that's going to be a big, big challenge. Okay. And each week I'm going to encourage you to kind of go into it fresh. Okay. Last chance. Questions, comments, anything.
When I was a kid, I went to a lot of evangelical churches, and I'm struck by how much of what I would call common day theology is reflected in this particular gospel by that whole early community or the more evangelical, traditional readers of the Bible.
Yep. Yep.
What do you mean by common days, Sheila?
The gospel of love, the oh gosh, I'd have to see what struck me as I was wandering through it, as you were wandering through it.
For each other is a big one. It's very
the love for each other, the not necessarily the anti-Semitic stuff, but the sense of not necessarily siege mentality, but certainly this business in many evangelical churches is that we're on to something that the rest of them don't understand.
Yes.
And that I think comes true.
Yep. And here's what I'm going to say to that one, Sheila, is that's why I think this is so important we study this one, because I think the gospel of John has been co-opted, and it needs to be reclaimed and put in its context. And, 3:16 whole, everybody should be, you know what? Muslims, Jews, anybody should be able to hold up John 3:16 and find a way into that verse. I think that's what the whole point was.
The verses you had put down earlier, we learned to memorize all of those in the Baptist church, and certainly got in John 16. Those were common and for so important that every child in those Sunday schools knew.
Yeah. So I think it's important to kind of reclaim John too, and put it back in its context and say what might it mean for us.
Sorry, I'm muted because the dogs are all making
That's
so much
okay. I understand dog reality. Okay, everybody, then I'll see you next week, chapters 1 through 3 next, okay? Take care. Bye.
Thank you.